Good morning. Please turn with me to Romans, the first chapter, as pull up a chair again to take us through another perspective on just the overview of Romans. So you know that there's certain numbers that I'm fond of. Sevens, of course, as they come up all over the Bible, especially. When we talk about the Revelation, I talk about sevens all the time. If you know me, 3 is a number I'm kind of fond of. So if you heard me go through an overview of Romans twice, you know there's probably a third one coming, and this is it. And hopefully it will be a different perspective that'll keep it fresh enough as we go back to an approach we used before, and that is looking at it from the perspective of people, personalities, almost as if it is a play in which we are seeing different characters brought out. And so from that perspective, I want to call it them and then marriage. And this is not going to be a sermon that's going to be super helpful for marital principles, primarily because it's coming from a single guy. But it's going to point back to that perspective that God gives us going all the way back to the Old Testament on kind of how the relationship between he and his people is a lot like a marriage. Paul is going to bring that up by the time we get to chapter 7 literally. And so I was like, let's just go with it since it's there. And so with that, in chapter 1, we are going to visit some passages that we have seen before and kind of assemble this thing. As we were talking last week, some of the young people have gotten together to talk about doing some things. Like this time we're going to try to get out on campus. And if you know me, I'm kind of paranoid. I don't like to say too much before it actually happens, but we are trying to get out on LC's campus as school is starting this year to try to at least meet some folks and make a better start of it on campus than we might have last year when I was kind of bogged down, didn't know the area super well. And so as a part of that, one of the things we're talking about is building some of the things that actually appeal to young people. And that's what we call merch. And merch is short for merchandise. Or sometimes the kids will call it swag, meaning some things that you can wear or pick up that remind you of what you are about as an organization. It's like a brand. So as we've done that, we talked about, man, that sounds like it's kind of involved. And I was like, the good thing about technology nowadays is it's almost like Build-A-Bear. You don't have to be like our brother who knows how to code to be able to do some cool things with branding and merchandise and fill in the blank. And so in a lot of ways, that's what this sermon is going to be like. We're going to, God willing, put together some principles that we have already looked at from, like I said, just a different perspective. As in chapter 1, you might remember that we talked about the 2 halves of chapter 1, where it starts out him talking about how super encouraged he was by what he had heard about the Romans and how that made him even more hopeful that he would be able to see them in person. But then he goes on in the second half to talk about those, on the other hand, who do not so much believe in God. And so the first category or character I want to introduce us to is in chapter 1, verse 18, going through the end of the chapter. He's basically talking about the godless. Those who have certain things they could see about God, but they choose to enter into what we call nowadays denial. The things that they could know about God just go in one ear and out the other, or they go into their mind. And if you remember the concept of the 4 soils, he talked about there are 4 types of soils that a sower can go out to cast seed on. One of them is like the path where the seed doesn't penetrate much, but just about as soon as it sets there, it goes away. And so he seems to be talking about those here who are godless because they don't want the things that they can see about God to sink very deeply into their hearts. And so that's what he's talking about, as we saw in the end of chapter 1. But it doesn't stop there, because as we had mentioned in chapter 2, he is going to introduce us to the other end of the perspective. We might call them the religious. They believe a whole lot about God, but they're doing some of the same things the godless are doing. And Paul is reminding them that no matter what you believe about God, if you are engaged in the same conduct as those who are completely godless, what do you really think God's going to reward you with? And that is what we talked about, Romans being a metaphor for work. Because when we go to work, we get wages. And so by the time you get to chapter 6, he's going to say the wages of sin is death. But chapter 2, there's something that's easy to miss out on, because he's talking about you got an investment package that we've talked about on Wednesday nights and from time to time. So every time you get that check, you got a choice. There are 2 ways I can be bad with money. I can be bad because I'm spending my money every time I get it, unlike our folks who have saved and been able to. We had a housewarming this week. That was a blessed time because they were able to save and do some stuff, right? But on the other hand, I can be bad with money. I can spend it as soon as I get it. But there's another way I can be bad about it. I can make bad investments. And that's what he's talking about in chapter 2. You're going to get paid according to who you're actually working with, but by the time you get to chapter 8, he's talking about those who are able to enjoy the fruits of their lifetime of labor. And that's where all those promises come, where I'm convinced that neither death, nor life, nor death, nor all those things that he says that are bad, they can't compromise your relationship with God. But he doesn't say, as we say from time to time, that this is a hostage situation. He doesn't exclude my ability to make bad investments and smooth walk out of the opportunities that God has given me to invest in healthy things that he's willing to pay out with good things, with kindness, with rest at the end of a lifetime full of difficulty and labor. As our brother Sean pointed out in talking to the young people, sometimes I'm wary of talking to young people about harsh life lessons because they might not have been through all the same stuff that might have me kind of woe is me right now, right? But sometimes if you can relate, it's not too soon for middle school, as we said before, high school, to be a time where if you can put it in the right perspective, they understand hard times. And so what he's saying is your labor is not in vain. And why is that important? Because from time to time we talk about the Lewis and Clark Valley being a place with an incredibly high rate of suicide. And it has the highest rate of suicide per capita. They'll say it's not the most suicides because we're a relatively small space, but it's the highest rate of suicide in the state of Idaho. We had one man talk about to us, a psychiatrist that came to talk to some of the local preachers about that. And so it's not just in the older adults that have had life accumulate to a point where it's getting heavy enough where we just want to check out. He said one of the people he regretted not being able to reach in a lasting way was a 12-year-old boy who he was able to convince not to take his life for a while, but not forever, because that was one of his youngest patients to actually take his life. And so if we understand that people are going through it at a younger and younger age, and we realize the need to talk to them about realizing that there is a payout as long as you make your suffering count. And so that's much of a lot of what the book of Romans is about. You're going to suffer regardless. You can't get away from it if you know people. That's just the reality of it. But what Paul is encouraging them to do is invest their efforts and their labors in the kinds of things that makes it seem like it's worth it. And so there's a payout at the end, but we are serving a God who gives us along the lines, like when you make your investments with work and whatnot, you get those statements to where it's not just kind of this blind thing you're throwing money into, but you actually get to see it grow, right? And so God willing, that gives you the hope that, wait a minute, this is actually worth it. And so that's the God that we serve. Just as you get to see your investments grow over time, he's saying there's the same thing. If you allow God to help the Spirit, because by the time he's going to say, the Spirit intercedes for us in words and groans, or in groans that defy words. Things that we can't put into words about how we're suffering or how we're going through it or how we just don't know why we're not feeling at our best right now. The Spirit intercedes not only for us to God to help bring us into things that give us hope, but it helps us to understand ways in which God is showing us hope in things that it's not the words of a friend. We said sometimes there's just things in life I got to go through by myself because nobody's been through this the exact same way I'm going through it. As much as someone might try to encourage me, and we'll go back through that theme again, there are some times when God can just, every now and again, I'm driving more than most, I don't know. We've seen more deer this year, just in that short drive from the orchards to the building. And it's been just a burst of joy. I don't know why. I like seeing the wildlife, and so does Mama. And so we're in a time right now where sometimes God just brings it to you and just seeing the same old thing a different way from a more positive perspective. And that goes back to some of the things we talked about when we heard from Solomon, the wisest man in the world. Not just the wisest, he was the richest at the time, right? And he starts off Ecclesiastes talking about how grand life is when you got all the money and the smarts. Meaningless. Life is meaningless. And much of what he's talking about is how he learned to find joy in the simple things God would bring his way. Because he said with much learning comes much vexation. And so there was this irony in all of his wisdom, right? There was this irony in all of his accomplishments that there wasn't joy in all of those things. But it was just a good meal and good company, we said before, that sometimes set him back on the path to God showing him your labor is not in vain. And so Romans a lot is talking about likewise that whole concept of God reassuring you with simple things along the way that you might not see if God isn't opening our eyes to help us understand why it's not all bad. All right, with that. He is, however, saying one of the paths to getting that understanding is not in godlessness or it's not in idle religion, but it's in this thing that he's going to talk about in those middle verses, round about verse 12 going through roughly 24 of chapter 2, where there are these people who aren't sure what they believe about God yet, but they still have a conscience and a level of integrity that calls them to do right by one another, that basically calls them to do the very things God is calling them to do. And even though they might not be the best Christians, they're kind of the folks you trust with your money. They're the folks you might trust when your back is turned. They're the folks for whom Jesus is still a thing, even if they're not sure they want to come back to church yet. And so hopefully what we're doing by trying to get out on campus isn't just trying to show kids more church. It's trying to reach people who are already open and they're looking for other people they can trust. And so God willing, we're not just giving them another church to maybe go to. God willing, we're giving them an alternative in a place, in a time where it's not easy to find trustworthy people that you actually trust stuff you care about with. And so that's half of the motivation. And he's saying that's the group that's caught in the middle of godlessness and religiosity that's not actually looking a whole lot like Jesus. But chapter 3 is going to present a problem for everybody, because no matter how good I might be as a person, and the reason I don't want to go to church is I'm not sure I can trust those church folks, is chapter 3 is the famous passage about, buddy, your self-righteousness isn't going to work, because even though you might have amazing integrity, there are some things you still need God to help you with. Why? Because he designed you, and he realizes all the things that in the back of your mind you realize you would like to be better at, but for whatever reason, you can't bridge that gap. He is the counselor or the designer that can help you bridge the gap between who you want to be, chapter 7, and who you actually are, as we've talked about before. And so the dilemma he is going to say that visits all three of these groups, these characters we've seen, the godless, the religious, and the good character people who are just kind of non-affiliated, is they're all bound by sin. How do you know? Verse 9 of chapter 3. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Going on. So that creates the problem. There's none of us who can be good enough, even if we still care about integrity, to really impress God. Because the law is there not to help me understand, oh, wait a minute, I was doing all that stuff anyway. I don't need to go back to church. No. If you're really looking at the law, all of it, you realize that between now and the ride home, there's going to be a pretty good chance you're not going to obey all those speed limits, are you? If you are, you're doing a whole lot better than me. That's part of the law too, right? But that's a small example of all kinds of things that are written into the law that we're violating probably on a pretty regular basis, which is why we need mercy. Not so we can just have God, thank you, God, for letting me speed however I want through these school zones. No. So that, God willing, I can get better about obeying the laws, and even though they might be an annoyance to me, they might help some of our folks who have kids walking through those school zones, right? And so I begin to care more about the things that are annoying to me about the law, but are there to actually keep people from having unnecessary heartache. And so grace isn't there to provide me an excuse to keep doing stuff that's too tough in the law. It's there to help me get better about obeying more and more of it until I become the person that God knows I can be, righteous before the law, and righteous in that other meaning of righteousness that we saw, and it's justice. When he says he is the justifier, he justifies us before we're actually good at being decent people. That word just, we said, it just basically means you're already in the mindset of the perspective we took last week of living out the golden rule. And the perspective I want to look at it from this week is once we realize that we need to care about treating others the way that they, the way that we want to be treated, is it's what we've talked about before. It's muscle memory. It's muscle memory. Are we practicing it enough to where it becomes intuitive and ingrained in us to the point where we now look like the kind of person that, God willing, some of these new students will actually want to follow? And why is that important? Because they shouldn't want to be following near one of us. But Paul literally said, imitate me as, please say it louder, brother. Thank you. Right, thank you. Coming from a visitor and an elder, thank you. Right? And so to the degree they're able to see something different in us because we are not conformed to what's going on, that's where retention may happen, God willing. So we can have all the best merch, all the best swag, we can have flashy new stuff on the website, blah, blah, blah. But if all they see is the same old thing, we may be lucky to see them for a week or two, and they'll see right through. And so as we set our goal in the past couple of weeks is looking at, wait a minute, some of this list of do-nots, and it's not just do-nots. By the time we get to chapter 12, he's going to give us a lot of affirmative things that we can do to begin to look more like Christ. That's basically 12 through 15. That's the practical part of, okay, you've already told us what not to do, Paul. Marcus, you quote that every week. But affirmatively, 12 through 15 is a whole lot of chapters that all revolve around practical things you can do to look like what we saw before. That sermon that keeps coming up every now and again, people repeat it to me. It's really interesting, that whole question that somebody challenged me with before. So what are we known about? What are we known as the churches of Christ? What are we known as? And we had all this list of things. And the thing that they were talking about in John 13 was, they will know you by your, thank you. And so God willing, between now the list we have in Romans and the list that looks a lot like it in Galatians, we said we got that growth chart. And we're going to try to add one more thing to that growth chart to measure to see whether or not we're looking more and more like the kind of place that they would want to, God willing, come and stay and help build at, right? And so that's what we're seeing here in chapter 3. We're saying, look, none of us are going to get there by righteousness because the law is there to help us not to look righteous, but it's there by the time you get to chapter 7. He is going to say it's there to help make you aware of all the things that you ain't doing perfectly. Why? Because when I look in the mirror, I see the same thing every morning. So I'm looking for the same flaws on the same old face. It's not good at showing me, right, the things that ain't in the mirror that I still need to fix. And he says that's the value in the law. See, it's one thing if I have a level of integrity that just helps me want to fix what I see in the mirror. But one of the reasons why we go to doctors and get all those examinations and whatnot is sometimes they can give us a good word that comes from some things that are going beneath the surface. That say there's hope if you're able to do these things. There's life and potential and possibility in looking beyond the mirror to see that there are some other things. That if you're willing to tweak these things, we can improve your investments. We can make them a better return on all this labor that you're doing, all this suffering that you're going through. So it doesn't really feel like it's always in vain. If you let him, the one who designed you, give you a look at the law that helps give you a look beneath the surface of the things we already know we need to work on. And so that's what the law is for. It's not so I can pat myself on the back about all the stuff I got right. It's to give me a fuller picture of what it is that I need to work on so I'm not working on some real unpleasant surprises by the time I actually have to see God face to face. You remember all those stories about Daniel, as righteous as Daniel was. What was his reaction when he saw the Son of Man? Oh my goodness, right? Fell at his feet as he was dead. Revelation, John, the beloved disciple, the one they had the rumor about, we don't know if this guy's going to die. At the end of John, because Jesus loved him so much, he sees Jesus in Revelation chapter 1 at his feet as dead. They say there are levels to this thing. And so when Jesus said, even John the Baptist, among those born of women, there's nobody better than John. But of those who are actually in the kingdom of God, he's the least. There are levels. And so what he's doing in Romans is filling out that picture we get of Jesus. Jesus, who is trying to help us understand the way that we can get to 1 John. Part of what he talks about, we have confidence before God. Not because I've been able to find a spin on biblical teaching that makes me feel good where I'm at, but because I'm looking at those, right? I'm looking at those tough lessons right now that let me open up every part of my life to God so that I don't have any unpleasant surprises when I have to actually see him face to face, right? I'm so debating on making a metaphor, right? That's one of the reasons why I want to talk about when I was young. One of the reasons why, too many stories. I told you the Oklahoma story before, right? Well, lived from Texas, but we had this drill called Oklahoma. And Oklahoma was a drill where we had it every, it was regular, where linemen got to line up against linemen. You got nobody to help you. It's just you versus that one. We're going to see who's tougher. And most of the time, it's just a drill to get you ready for the other guy, right? We're not trying to hurt you, but we need to give you a full speed idea of what it looks like to really be in full contact. But sometimes you could talk your way into Oklahoma if you thought you should have been starting when you weren't. And guess who talked themselves into a good old round of Oklahoma before everybody won practice? Yours truly. And even though Oklahoma didn't go so bad for me that day, it wasn't great. I wasn't as much better as the other guys I thought I was. And that was one of my first lessons, of keeping your mouth shut and just proving it. It's not because I never backbit. It's because I had enough experiences with backbiting. I just got tired of being one thing in my mind and the other thing in reality. I just got old. And so, thank you, right? And that's in a lot of ways what Romans is doing for Jesus' teaching. That's what Jesus is living out in the Gospels. And that's one of the reasons why his life was so hard. It's hard when you're telling not only yourself, but it's hard enough when you're telling yourself. But when you start telling other people about things you see that, try that out for a good week. See how that works out for you. Just go ahead and make a list of all your friends, and then you go tell them all the stuff just the factual stuff, right? Just the stuff, not the stuff that's your opinion. You just go check, just cross them names off by it. You might still be friends. You might not be talking the same by the end of the week. So now you understand Jesus' life. He didn't spend a whole lot of time mixing words with Nicodemus. He didn't spend a whole lot of time mixing words with anybody throughout the Gospels. Remember when the lady was asking him to heal her child, and he said, it's not right to give the children's bread to the dogs? Thank you. That made him super popular. Because she couldn't do nothing about it, but the scribes and the Pharisees and everybody else could, and he was saying the same things to them, because like we say in our culture, he kept that same energy. Now, what this book is telling us to do in Romans is keep that same energy and see what happens to your friends and your friendships. But just because you have the wisdom to understand that's not a great way to build friends and make friends and win over people, whatever, doesn't mean you get a pass just because you have the wisdom to understand when to speak and when to shut up. Because the temptation is, like we said, go the godless route. I just never speak. Y'all know me. That's pretty much, when I'm not here being paid to talk, he's just shutting up for the most part until he's driving again. That's another story, sorry. Right? Thank you, sister. It's a confession. See me out on the road, it's a confession. I'm just leaving it there. But with that, there's the gap between where I am and, God willing, where I would like to be. Candid in love. And not just candid because I got to get something off my mind, my chest, however you want to say it, right? And so that's a lot of what we're seeing, because he's saying the way out is, okay, Marcus, if you want to stop being that guy in traffic, well, what's the way out? Chapter 6, the solution. Harsh terms breed up a lot of debate nowadays. It's slavery. We can get a lot of debates. Well, is slavery biblically legal? Well, I can tell you it's biblically mandated in Romans, and it ain't for any one group of people other than every Christian. We're not going to go back through it. Read Romans yourself, please, because I preached heavily from it last week. But verses roughly 12 through the end of the chapter in Romans 6, over and over again, that's the chapter that talks about righteousness. And your relationship to righteousness is slavery. And say, okay, if slavery is too harsh a term, I got chapter 7, and that's where our subtitle comes from, marriage. If you join me in chapter 7, verse 1. Or do you not know, brothers, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law is binding on a person as long as he lives. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is still alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, and if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. Verse 4, likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. And understand how sometimes you have to understand a thing by the sum of its parts. Because there are a lot of people who talk about worshiping God now, but we can't come together as one group. Just list the reasons. I mean, the churches of Christ, one of the things we've been good about is talking about denominationalism. They believe in God too, don't they? It's not like Islam where we say that's a completely different God altogether, even though it's all through Abraham. But they might believe in the same God too, but they believe that the final prophet for him is, help me out, Muhammad. That's it, thank you, right? Well, they all believe in God. Well, why all these differences? Well, it's because the Spirit is saying some things that like I told you, I love that part of the forest that it's in my wheelhouse. And so when we mentioned last week from the perspective of missing the forest for the trees, if we're looking at God's law and the good things about God without always remembering that it connects back to what Paul is going to say, which goes back to the golden rule, he's going to say when he gets to those passages about love, what does your walk practically look like in chapters 12 through 15? He's going to say the fulfillment of the law is loving your neighbor as yourself. And that goes back to what we mentioned in terms of golden rule. He's pointing back to Jesus. Whatever you would like for people to do to you, do that to them. And so that is what he's saying. That's that fundamental that gets us back to, okay, how can I begin to get back to true north? Because if I keep this Bible as my compass, and I realize that every passage I'm reading is pointing back to that as due north, then I'm not lopping off chunks of the word and creating my own new version of the Church of Christ. I'm not creating my own new version of fill in the blanks. I'm not creating my own new version of okay, you get it. The denominations part is easy, but there's some more relevant parts that matter now in a time when, we had all the denominations back when we were probably, honestly, more unified as a nation. Now we're maybe more divided as ever, and people don't talk about denominationalism anymore. They barely even care about that. Because as I've talked about, you can get your own flavor of God or Jesus, even though there's just one, as soon as you turn on the internet and start clicking on stuff. And you can fit Jesus into whatever it is you want to believe. And you know what? You don't even have to think to create your own theology, because there are people who are making their money. The traffic to their website is coming in because they're doing the thinking for you. And all you got to do is pick the right one to feed you what you need to believe. That's truthy, that's Jesus-y, but it's not. And here's the thing. One of the things that in chapter 1 that I neglected to mention is the thing that he highlights in those who don't believe in God are three things that are unique, that he highlights. It seems that it's just unique to people who just don't believe in God at all. But he's going to say in subtle ways you're kind of doing the same things. And one of the things he's going to talk about, he literally says, please back up with me since I messed it up. In verse, what is it? Verse 18 of chapter 1. He's going to say one of the things that's a low-key way in which he sees a problem both in the godless and the religious. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And that was a theme I haven't mentioned that I've seen over and over in Romans. It's our relationship to truth that has a lot to do with that middle group, whether or not we find ourselves in the group that is actually being obedient. Why? Because he's going to talk about the truth again in what has led them astray in verse 26. I lied. In verse 24 beginning. Therefore God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And the third category that basically sums up all those things, those boxes we talked about, those boxes or check boxes we talked about, what we could possibly call that checklist of do nots at the end of the chapter can really be summed up in verses 28 and 29, where he says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness. And then it goes on to talk about the specific types, I would call it, of unrighteousness. But chapter 2, as we skipped over, is going to say, therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, practice the very same things. And so if we look at it in terms of those categories, one of the things he's cautioned us to stay away from are three subtle categories. Falling into that temptation too, as we look at the law and the way in which it helps us see all the things that we want to work on or that we need to work on after we've developed a desire to want to work on things. Avoid the desire to, just like the pagans, suppress the truth. Because like we talked about at the very beginning, denial is one of those responses to difficult changes that need to be made. Likewise, I don't necessarily have to engage in denial and flat out suppress the truth if I'm willing to exchange it for a version that's just more of a fit with what I've got going on. And so that's the second thing he warns them against doing. And so because he links it to them using it to dismiss God, he's saying you don't get caught up on the fact that he's talking about stealing in chapter 2 and robbing idols or robbing temples for idols not being evidence of your idolatry. And he's talking specifically about adultery. Don't think that just because those are three things he checks off, just, I haven't robbed no idols. I haven't stolen. I haven't done that other one. I'm in the clear. No. Think back to chapter 1 and think about if there is any way that you have been led by this culture, by this life, by your environment, by family, whatever, to begin suppressing the truth about anything. Do you really think you're going to stand before God having adopted a habit of suppressing the truth about anything and have him go, well done, my good and faithful? No, he's asking you to fix that. Because that's what his son did. And so just like we talked about, one of the reasons why Jesus, outside of his 12 apostles, he wasn't able to keep a whole lot of friends. Why? Because after they were loving him after the miracles, right? Did all the healings. You have to eat his flesh and his blood. What? Yeah, if you don't eat his flesh and his blood, you have no life in you. Why would you even say that, man? We're trying to build the following, right? We got a whole bunch of cliques. Now you're saying weird stuff. Not weird, it's from God. But understand, that's the parallel that we're on. I've told you before, I run a modest channel. I ain't making no money, right? But the temptation is once it starts going steady in a certain way, I'm willing to sacrifice everything else I need to pay attention to just to keep growing it. And I don't want to say things that make people go away, right? But he's saying you need to basically avoid the temptation to suppress the truth to grow your fill in the blank. For me, it's the channel. For me, it's whatever. For me, it's this and that. But thank you. We're all going to have the same temptation to suppress the truth to keep friends, to do something. And if not, we don't have to suppress the truth. Let's just put a spin on it that fits what my buddies believe. And that's an even more subtle danger, right? And so that's two things he's saying the godless are doing that he's saying the religious are in the temptation to do just as well. And one of the reasons why he's saying that middle group is so blessed is because one of the reasons why they might feel so isolated is because they've already embraced the reality of what it feels like to lose friends because they told the truth. And so a lot of those people who aren't offended when he says it's not right to take the children's food and give it to the little dogs, you think that's the first time that woman was insulted in her life? I'm going to make up the story and say, I'm going to go out on a limb and say no. As a Samaritan, she might have heard a few other insults right there in Israel. because they weren't necessarily all that highly regarded among the Israelites. And so one of the things he's looking for are people who are tough enough to look at the law and still move forward. They're not frightened by the things that he is asking them to do. And so as we go back to that parallel of the four soils, the four soils aren't just there. The weather isn't conducive to growing all the time. The good soil is the one that was able to produce rain, shine, whatever. I'm not a farmer, but I know weather ain't good all the time. And that's the thing that's I think enduring about the good soil metaphor for what we see going on here in Romans. He's finding the people who have been, like we say, I haven't preached the four soils. I didn't preach it this way, but one of the things that we lose in the poetry about the four soils is, and as a city feller, I know that most times when I'm looking at fields, they kind of grow up and they're not looking like they're ready to be planted in between seasons. And so there's some work that has to be done to get that soil ready. And if I think about that just as soil, I'm just like, well, you got to get the field ready. I'm the field. And there are some things that God does to me that hurt, that get me ready for being able to be productive. And so the more I'm in touch with what God is doing, the more I'm in touch with the soil matters, the more I'm like, oh, wait a minute. If I look at myself as that soil, that tool he's using to turn it up and get those rocks out, or to pull those thorns, or all those things that keep a field from being productive, God's doing that to me too. And maybe that when I'm trying to figure out whether or not my labor is in vain, now the hard times seem like they're preparation as opposed to punishment more and more. It's not like they're not punishment, but God's wisdom helps me understand which category to put it in, so that I'm not lining up every hard time as an attack by life on me. And God is growing me in the wisdom to see how he's growing me even in times that hurt. And so that is one of the reasons why by the time we get to the later chapters, he's saying one of the things he has to do with us is part of the breaking up is like I mentioned, I would love to say that from the time I was a youngin', I was just always interested in the well-being of other people. Mama, that's true. Well, I just loved other people so much. I never thought about me. Oh, I was just like I was selfish. And spare the rod, spoil the child. I grew up in Texas. I got some whoopings. Oh, some things that had to do with not being selfish no more. Those whoopings hurt, but God willing, they worked. And so in a lot of ways, that's what he's talking about, because by the time we got to chapter 8, we had a great question on Wednesday night. There are a lot of big words in that passage. What do they mean? We said sometimes you get those answers just by reading them out of a different version of the Bible. And so when we read it out of the the Common English Bible, all that stuff he's talking about, the flesh versus the spirit, it all of a sudden started to become a whole lot more clear when he said in verse 1 of chapter 8 from the Common English Bible, so now there isn't any condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. God has done what was impossible for the law, since it was weak because of selfishness. God condemned sin in the body by sending his own son to deal with sin in the same body as humans who are controlled by sin. He did this so that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us. Now that we live based on the Spirit, not based on selfishness. People whose lives are based on selfishness think about selfish things, but people whose lives are based on the Spirit think about things that are related to the Spirit. The attitude that comes from selfishness leads to death, but the attitude that comes from the Spirit leads to life and peace. So the attitude that comes from selfishness is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law because it can't. People who are self-centered aren't able to please God. And so the hard times have a very simple purpose. He is breaking up those parts of my heart that are still hardened about what I want, whether or not that is good for you. And it's not about me always sacrificing so much of myself that I just do whatever you want just because you tell me. That makes me the kind of person people don't respect very much once they're done with you. But it's finding the right balance between my needs and your needs and not disregarding what's best for all of us. And so part of the hard times are to get me out of the habit of being self-interested, much like Mama's belt. help me along that path. And so mama's belt, daddy's belt can't do it all. But much like we said with that woman who was used to hearing maybe some tough things by the time she met Jesus, she could still get her daughter healed because she wasn't so in her feelings about being likened or compared to a dog. She understood the very thing that caught Esau up. Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Because we saw by the time you get to chapter 9, he uses 3 examples of self-interested people that God chose not to include in the line of his son. We saw it in Ishmael, right? And even though it doesn't say it, none of them were righteous because of the law, because they all got the blessings of the promise, Abraham, before they'd done anything right. That's why it's called credited for righteousness. But we saw in Ishmael, he was what they call a wild donkey of a man who was always at it with guilty. Marcus, why is that not you? Well, God willing, because I'm trying to be always at it in the style of Jesus. Because you look at his life, and for whatever reason, trouble always seemed to find him as long as he started telling the truth. But Ishmael wasn't so much like that. It seemed that self-interest caused him or provoked him to find trouble in places where there could have been peace, as opposed to speaking truth in a way that brought the trouble to him. There's a difference. And without godly wisdom, I'll lump them all in the same bucket, and I'll use the fact, well, that guy always stays in trouble. I'll use that as an excuse to ignore the truth and what God might be doing through that individual, right? But if I'm looking at the Word, I can measure the people against the life of Christ and understand whether or not the trouble is coming into their life because they are living and looking more like Christ, or whether or not they are constantly self-seeking and finding trouble because they can't be satisfied with another thing that was on that list, covetousness. No matter how much they have, they got to have something else from the person in the next lane. The Joneses always keep them dissatisfied with whatever they've got. Ever been around that? Yeah. Right? Thank you. And so we're saying, and so that's what the breaking up, that's what the tilling is. That's what the painful parts are. Because we know what it looks like in other people, where you can never have something nice. You can never have a good moment around them. Because every time you have a good moment, something's going to have to happen to undermine that. But it's tougher when I see that in myself. Or even worse, I don't see it in myself, and God sees it in me, and he's bringing me in through things that are helping to get that part out of my character. Because it's just as unattractive in me to God as it is when I see it in others. And so part of the painful processes I go through is so that he can get that level of self-interest out of me, so that I don't have to be a burden on the growth and the work that others are doing. In the same way I found others to be a burden every time I'm trying to make a move forward. And there's always just, you know what it's like. You've already said it, all right? And so that's once again, as Brother Tony yelled out last week in response to a question, right? Chapter 2 is about parity. It's about being the same way. Like we said, that's golden rule. If I know what it's like to want to be encouraged, and I had to thank some, didn't have to, got to thank some sisters this morning for consistently being encouraging. Because one was thanking another for how encouraging she was. But I was like, wait a minute, you're pretty encouraging too. So God willing, by the time we get to these 12 through 15 chapters, he's going to say, yeah, it's okay to try to keep up with the Joneses in some things. Outdo one another in what? Showing kindness. And showing appropriate honor to one another. That's how I got to see an example of that, Romans, this morning, right? And so with that, that's all he's trying to do. He's trying to get us to a place where, God willing, when we come through, we can be encouraged mutually. Just like he starts out in the very first chapter, being encouraged by people he's never met before, because he's already heard about the cool things that they are doing. And that's what the pain is producing. That's what the pain is producing. Why? Because if it was all just I've been really encouraged about your report, I say it from time to time, it would be a really short letter. But most of the letter is written about all the painful things he has to say to help them improve on the foundation of love that they have. To improve on the foundation we talked about last week of faith that's famous throughout the world. And by the time we get to the end of the book, it's obedience. He's congratulating for them for all the things they've got going well, but it's the things, the painful things he has to say and the painful things that God is going to have to take them through to get them ready to be with Christ. What was the difference between the beginning of the creation and Christ's call in the Sermon on the Mount? Day 1, it was good. Day 2, it was good. Day 3, so and so forth. And when he creates man after that day, it was very good. By the time we get to Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, he starts the story off with, be perfect. It's raising the level. And that's easy to miss if, especially like Romans is saying, if I've begun, by the time we get to chapter 10, two things I'm going to miss out on. When he says, okay, now there's an example in Israel in chapter 9. They thought that it was by birth that they were going to be the children of God, but that's why he gives you the Ishmael, the Esau example. No, but it's not by birth. Just pay attention to your own history and stop focusing on the places, the part that makes you look like the children of God. But like we said before, we are born again and can slip into the same attitude if we think our baptism entitles us to any more than the birth or the lineage of Jacob, Israel, entitle them to be his forever. And so that's why he says in chapter 10, verses 1 through 3, if you join me there, we'll try to, God willing, just wind it up. He's going to say there's another pitfall they can fall into. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes. That is not faith only. I'm not going through that again. But the bottom line is, he's talking about there is a righteousness of God. It's not an easy button righteousness where Jesus died and now I just get to do whatever I want to do. It's going back to chapter 6. I have to be enslaved to the idea that I am the golden rule. And to the degree I don't represent the golden rule when people look at me anymore, that's more work that I need to do, right? And so here's the thing. One of the one thing that I want us to, God willing, take away from that foundation, we go, okay, Marcus, you talk about fairness and justice and golden rule all the time. It's another thing that I saw in my own life. Oh, when we were talking about the forest for the trees. One of the things that you don't have to persuade me about issues of justice as long as they're in my patch of forest. Oh, if they're in my favorite patch of forest, you cut down a tree out of my forest, I'm going to go get the law after you. You done took something from me, and we need to make that right. You see how nobody has to explain fairness to me if I feel like I'm losing? Oh, but that's one of the reasons why it's important, and like we said before, have God expand our hearts to see all parts of the forest that he cares about. Because I can play all kinds of mental gymnastics with suppressing the truth, exchanging the truth for a lie. If I start seeing trees being pulled up, uprooted, and cut down in a part of the forest I couldn't care nothing about, but that's still part of God's forest. And that's where God cuts through the games that I play with truth and integrity and justice. He says, it'd be one thing if you didn't understand justice at all. You know where I got this from? At least, okay, I'm not going to say I got it. Where God put those two things together. You know the test when people are pleading not guilty by reason of insanity in court? It's one of those things where they go talk to the doctor, but one of the ways you can cut through that litmus test, where I did it, but I didn't know what I was doing, is if they're always able to figure things out when they're about to be harmed personally. See, it's one thing if I didn't realize it was a knife and I stabbed everybody, but for some reason I wasn't stabbing myself. You get it. That cuts through the psychobabble. And no matter what the psychiatrist says, that person understands the boundary between hurting other people and hurting themselves. If they stop at burning their own stuff or hurting their own stuff or a part of that, because see, sometimes you get the frauds where, they got the insurance money, so they'll go ahead and burn it down because they can still, you got to trace all the steps. But if they're really, really damaging themselves in the same ways they were hurt other people, now you're starting to see evidence that they really might not be in touch with reality. But beyond that, one of the telltale signs is that bright line between hurting me and hurting you that typically gives away that whole concept of, are they really out of touch with reality, or are they simply pretending because they just don't care about what happens to you? And so when we're talking about that whole concept of marriage, that goes back to the Old Testament, when over and over again he's talking to his people about they are an unfaithful spouse because they always understand the things that are going to hurt them. They just don't care about the things that are hurting other people, either outside of Israel or inside of Israel, that have nothing to do with their bottom line. And so it's the same thing. He's saying, you have a mistress, and it's called self-interest. You have a mistress, and it's called self-righteousness. And when it suits you, you come home. But when you're not feeling violated or wronged or whatever, you're out doing whatever it is you want to do. And justice only matters to you when you feel like you're losing. And that is, once again, what he's talking about. When he says you have a spouse in Romans, he's not only going back to the principles that Jesus talked about, he's going back to the old covenant principles that prophesied the coming of the Christ. God is looking for consistency, because one day we're going to have to see God, and he's going to test us on how fair we were with the trees on everybody's property, not just our own. And so as we are looking at this whole concept of them, there are 2 points, 2 pivot points, where, like we said at the very beginning, when you look at those characters, he's saying, you get it when you see them, the ungodly or the godless people, when you see them doing wrong, but help God help you understand the things that I'm doing. They're a whole lot like what they're doing too. The degree to which I'm tempted to suppress the truth, exchange it for a lie, engage in or approve of all manner of unrighteousness. And all likewise, you see the way in which Israel fell because they were self-righteous, because they created a law that was kind of like the law of God, but it just carved out their favorite principles and just had them worshiping that portion of the law. Understand, in chapter 11, he's going to be like, if God lobbed off the natural branches because they became hypocritical over what parts of the law they were going to observe, what's he going to do to us? As he's writing to the Gentiles to be, like they say, consistent and keep that same energy. So if I could sum it up in anything, like I said, sometimes I expose just how old I am using old slang. But the young people have a phrase that sums up the book of Romans quite well. Please, if you do nothing else between between now and the time we get to Galatians, pray to have God help you keep that same energy more and more, because of the way that term reflects what he's calling us to do in the Golden Rule, and the way he's trying to prepare us for a culture that tells us, okay, I'm way past time, I apologize. Right? Ultimately, he's saying, this is one of the reasons why I spent so much time harping on that whole concept of faith only. Because we live in a culture, one of our idols is confidence. Oh man, if you got confidence, you can persuade people of all kinds of things. And the Bible talks about confidence, but it's the confidence that comes from, like I heard a pro ball player one time, when he had young people were asking, well, how did you get such a good handle? He was an MVP one year, most valuable player in the NBA, a point guard. He said, my confidence comes from preparation. And so I don't come and make a whole lot of bluster in front of the guys that I have to compete against, because once I get out on the court, they're going to see through whether or not I'm actually prepared. But my confidence comes from the fact that over and over again, I'm getting in reps. And it's just like Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, from the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so when we see in the young people who talk about keep that same energy, one of the reasons is that if we keep that same energy with ourselves, we are not growing atrophied and we are not growing deficient in areas where God is trying to make us naturally have the kind of confidence that the world is telling us, we'll just pretend like you're a good Christian and people will believe it, right? It doesn't come from pretending. If you really develop that kind of, I say it all the time, that kind of relationship with God. As I apologize for preaching way too long as we together stand and sing.